Ryan.
Yeah, and Miguel, they do it every single year. 1 million people in Times Square. Don't know how they do it, but they do it. All right, Miguel, thank you for that report. Well, New York is not the only place expected to see rain tonight. It could be a wet night for millions of people up and down the East Coast. Let's bring in CNN meteorologist Chad Myers. Chad, what does the forecast look like right now?
I mean, all the way from Iowa to Boston and then down south toward Atlanta as well. This is a warm storm. That's the good news compared to last year, where the wind chill at midnight in New York City was 5 below zero. Tonight it's going to feel like 50. So a big change from there. So it is raining in some spots. It will be thunderstorming in other spots. If you're standing outside, there may be lightning in your forecast. Here, even toward Atlanta, there could be some thunder and lightning around. But now, this is the future radar. This is what it should look like for the rest of the day. At 4 o'clock, it's raining in New York. At 9 o'clock, it looks like it's going to break, but then more rain comes in from Pennsylvania. And then it looks like it's going to break again, and it doesn't. So just one wave of rain after another, and thunder showers and thunderstorms all the way down toward the deep south. Now, farther out to the west, it's a different story. It isn't a warm storm. It's a cold storm. The high today in Las Vegas will be 44. And there will be rain, snow in Flagstaff, rain all the way down to Phoenix. Looks like by midnight, though, Phoenix, that your rain should be over, and then maybe by 1 or 2 o'clock moving well off to the east. But it's still going to be a very cool night in Phoenix, Arizona today. 46 will be the high by midnight, somewhere closer to 39, 36 in Chicago. How can it be 10 degrees warmer in New York City than Phoenix on New Year's Eve? But that is the forecast. So the rain is going to keep things moist and damp and all that kind of stuff. But for some of those on, what did he say, Plan B? Or did it say Plan P? I'm not sure what that was. That may be a good thing.
That might have been by design for Miguel. Right. Interpret it as you wish, right, That's Chad? Right. All right. Yes. Could be a very ugly night throughout the country. Chad, thank you for that report. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Well, it is day 10 of the partial government shutdown with no end in sight. Some 800,000 federal workers with no idea when they will get their next paycheck. President Trump holed up at the White House, firing off tweets again this morning, including calls for what he describes as a, quote, strong and powerful wall. The president not budging on his demand for $5 billion to build that wall. Democrats, of course, do not appear ready to budge either as they get set to take control of the House of Representatives on Thursday. CNN's Sarah Westwood joins us now from the White House. Sarah, the president busy this morning on Twitter. What exactly is he saying?
That's right, Ryan. And President Trump is still holding firm on his demand for $5 billion for a border wall, and a deal looks increasingly far off, even as aides and allies try to muddy the waters around what actually qualifies as a wall, whether that's a fence, whether that's steel slats. Now, the president has told aides that he would not support a bill that funds border security and a fence at $1.3 billion. That's the offer Democrats had on the table before the shutdown began, but he hasn't really specified what kind of deal he would accept, how much less than that $5 billion demand he'd be willing to take. But Senator Lindsey Graham, a top Trump ally, said yesterday after a 2-hour lunch with the president that Trump was open-minded about a deal that would involve him sticking with that $5 billion demand, but also supporting a temporary renewal of DACA protections for young undocumented immigrants. Take a listen.
The president didn't commit, but I think he's very open-minded. I know there's some Democrats out there who would be willing to provide money for wall border security if we could deal with the DACA population and TPS people. And hopefully we can get some serious discussions started maybe as soon as next week.
Now, Democratic leaders have not yet indicated whether they would support that kind of proposal, but similar proposals have failed on Capitol Hill in the past. Now, the president this morning was also goading Democrats about their past votes on border security, tweeting, "I'm in the Oval Office. Democrats, come back from vacation now and give us the votes necessary for border security, including the wall. You voted yes in 2006 and 2013. One more yes, but with me in office, I'll get it built and fast." So, Ryan, President Trump is still keeping the pressure up, but it's clear that there's really no end in sight still for the partial government shutdown.
All right, Sarah Westwood, thank you for that update live from the White House. Now to a big developing story in Russia. The government says it has detained a U.S. citizen on suspicion of spying. In a statement, the Federal Security Service says that Paul Whelan was arrested on Friday in Moscow, quote, while carrying out an act of espionage. CNN senior international correspondent Matthew Chance joins me now. Matthew, what more are you hearing about this?
Well, not a lot more. In fact, details about this Paul Whelan, as has been identified by the Russian authorities, are very sketchy. We've had a statement, as you may know, from the US State Department saying that they're aware a US citizen has been taken into custody and they've asked for consular access. It's not been clear yet whether that access has been granted. But it was just a few hours ago that the FSB, which is the Federal Security Services, the lead agency in Russia responsible for counter-espionage, rather, announced that it had taken into custody this US citizen, Paul Whelan. And that's the only statement they made. There's been no further reaction to it. But it is interesting that a relationship that has been dogged by allegations of espionage and spying over the past couple of years should end 2018 in this way. It was just a couple of weeks ago, remember, that Maria Butina, who is a Russian gun activist in the United States, pleaded guilty to being an agent of the Russian government and attempting to infiltrate and influence conservative groups like the National Rifle Association in the US. She faces a 6-month prison sentence. This character, Paul Nicholas Whelan, as he's been named by the Russian Foreign Ministry, faces up to 20 years if he's found guilty of espionage. And so it's a much more being regarded as a much more serious incident here, Ryan.
And Matthew, does this happen often? When was the last time something like this happened in Russia?
Well, it doesn't happen that often, but it does occasionally punctuate the relationship. I mean, call it off the top of my head, I think it was back in 2013 that we last saw an American citizen that was detained in this way. I think he was a diplomat who was injured, sustained injuries after he fought with a security guard outside the US embassy, presumably in a bid to avoid being arrested for espionage activities. A few years before that, there was an American citizen, a diplomat, who was arrested on espionage charges as well, wearing a very bizarre, I remember very well because it was on state television, very bizarre blonde wig. And there was images of him sort of broadcast on state television in that way. It is something that occasionally happens, but when it does, it is a big thing. And so this is a very powerful message being sent by the Kremlin to the United States at this sensitive time at the end of 2018.
Yeah, no doubt, especially at a time where Vladimir Putin says that he is open to more dialogue. There's been conversations with him and President Trump. A very provocative move by the Russian government. Matthew Chance live in Moscow. We appreciate that report. The end of 2018, setting in motion the race for 2020. Just a short time ago, one of the top contenders to challenge President Trump announced the first step toward mounting a White House bid.
No matter where you live in America, and no matter where your family came from in the world, you deserve a path to opportunity. Because no matter what our differences, most of us want the same thing: to be able to work hard, play by the same set of rules, and take care of the people we love. That's the America I'm fighting for. And that's why today I'm launching an exploratory committee for president.
That, of course, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren jumping in early. Let's get the details now from CNN's MJ Lee. She's joining us live from Boston. MJ, what is the significance of the timing of this announcement and, of course, the decision to do it today on New Year's Eve of all days? MJ?
Well, Ryan, I am hearing that the decision to launch the exploratory committee today, that was a decision that was made actually weeks ago. And the source that I spoke to just earlier says that the decision was not really about other potential Democrats who could get in the field, though realistically, I have to say you can't imagine that that was not at least a part of their thinking. And a part of this decision really reflecting their eager desire to get the work started on building out an operation, building out an apparatus, and really starting to make the important hires that they will need to make to start this presidential campaign. Now, the video that the Warren folks released earlier today, all 4.5 minutes of it, providing a pretty good blueprint of what kind of a campaign we expect Senator Warren to run. She talked about some of the very themes that we have seen her talk about very many times over the years that we've seen her in public life, like fighting corruption, holding government accountable, and fighting economic inequality. And there was also a moment in the video where she had a pointed message about what she says is an echo chamber of hatred and bigotry around the country. Take a listen to that moment. moment.
Our government's supposed to work for all of us, but instead it has become a tool for the wealthy and well-connected. The whole scam is propped up by an echo chamber of fear and hate designed to distract and divide us. People who will do or say anything to hang on to power point the finger at anyone who looks, thinks, prays, or loves differently than they do.
Now, not surprising that in that piece of the video, we saw images of President Trump. Just another reminder that Senator Warren has been such an outspoken critic of the president, and we expect that to be a big part of her message going forward. And if you look at the recent polling, we do know that she is generally well-liked and generally well-known among primary voters. But that does not guarantee that those data points will necessarily translate into votes. And so much of that, as you know very well, will be very dependent on who else decides to get in and when, and Senator Warren will have to make a lot of decisions depending on what the field looks like. Ryan.
MJ, no doubt about that. Elizabeth Warren, formidable, but there could be a number of formidable candidates, and that could determine who the eventual nominee will be. MJ Lee live in Boston. MJ, thank you for that. Let's talk about this now. Chris Liu, former White House cabinet secretary under President Obama. He was also on President Obama's Senate staff when he announced his presidential run back in 2007. And Alice Stewart, who's a CNN political commentator who's worked on several Republican presidential campaigns, including Ted Cruz's in 2016. Chris, let's start with you. I'm very curious about the timing for Elizabeth Warren here. It happens on New Year's Eve of all days, during the middle of a government shutdown. And we should point out that really the point of an exploratory committee is basically giving you the mechanism by which to raise money. What do you think of the timing of all of this based on the fact that we're in a holiday and in the middle of a government shutdown?
This makes a lot of sense politically for Elizabeth Warren, even if many of us aren't quite psychologically ready to begin the presidential race. You have to remember there are only a limited number of operatives who know how to win an early state like Iowa or New Hampshire. There's only a limited number of campaign bundlers who can help you raise the money. So by being the first out of the box, she can start hiring people, she can build the organization, she could raise money. You know, I go back to 2007 when Obama ran. He had this big splashy announcement in Springfield, Illinois. People forget he raised $25 million in that first quarter of 2007, more than any other candidate. So that's really the key to this, raising money.
Yeah. Okay. So, Alice, what do you think about the rollout? To Chris's point, is it smart for her to get out ahead of some of these other big Democrats that we expect to jump into the field?
From the logistical, boring aspect of presidential campaigns, it is. And Chris was exactly right. Knowing that there are more than a dozen people that are looking at throwing their hat in the ring, now is a good time to get in, make it official, help to start raising money, find an office, hire staff. And as he said, there's, not too many people that know exactly how to go about doing this, and now that it's official, people certainly will be willing to sign on board. The fear with this is getting out there and being the lead car. You've got the bullseye on your back now, and she's free game for attacks and criticism, and that's the challenge here. Generally, when you're this far out from a presidential election, you really don't want to be the lead car. You want to be in the pack, drafting off others, and wait and slowly. Slow and steady wins the race, but from a logistical and financial standpoint, is a smart thing to do. In the recent CNN poll we had, she's like the fourth person on the Democratic side behind key Democrat officials. We have certainly Joe Biden, Sanders, and Beto O'Rourke, and she's got to get out there and get her name out there a little bit more and really define her message. And I think the video she put out softens her, makes her a lot more personable. Yeah. So this is a good start.
Okay, but Alice, it's not as if Elizabeth Warren hasn't received her fair share of criticism over the course of her time as a U.S. Senator. And Chris, I do want to point out this editorial that was written by the Boston Globe about Elizabeth Warren earlier this month. Let me read a section of it for you. She said, it says, Warren missed her moment in 2016, and there's reason to be skeptical of her prospective candidacy in 2020. She has become a divisive figure. A unifying voice is what the country needs right now after the polarizing politics of Donald Trump. Is the Boston Globe right, Chris?
I don't think they're right. I think this is a moment when we're going to have as many as 20 different Democrats running for office. I don't think ultimately that many will make it to Iowa and New Hampshire. But this is a moment with an open primary in a way that really wasn't the case in 2016 with Hillary Clinton as a fundraiser. The advantage that Elizabeth Warren has is that she not only has the strong populist anti-Wall Street message, she has a record of accomplishment that she could put behind that, whether it's helping to start the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or a lot of her other Dodd-Frank, her efforts on that as well. The challenge is she has the right message. Is she the right messenger? She has higher negatives than some of the other candidates, and it's a question as to whether she can broaden her appeal beyond her base.
Okay, all right, Alice and Chris, terrific perspective. I can't believe we're already talking about 2020. It's not even 2019 yet. We still have a few hours left, but your perspectives are always appreciated. Still to come, President Trump fights with his outgoing chief of staff about his signature campaign promise. Why did John Kelly say that the idea of a concrete wall was abandoned early in the administration? We'll talk to the reporter who got that exclusive interview when we come back. The border wall. It is the president's signature campaign promise, but depending on who you ask within his administration, it may not be a wall at all. In an interview with the Los Angeles Times, the outgoing chief of staff, John Kelly, seemed to have a different interpretation, saying, quote, "To be honest, it's not a wall. We left a solid concrete wall early on in the administration when we asked people what they needed and where they needed it." That statement flying in the face of what President Trump is saying this morning, tweeting, quote, "An all-concrete wall was never abandoned," as been reported by some in the media. "Some areas will be all concrete, but the experts at the border prefer a wall that is see-through." Well, to help us sort out all of this, the writer behind that interview with General Kelly, Los Angeles Times reporter Molly O'Toole. Molly, congratulations on the interview. The president was up early responding to your reporting. I mean, you heard what the president tweeted this morning. He's basically saying that General Kelly doesn't seem to have this right. Is this just another example of their disconnect, which you appeared to really reveal, not just on the wall, but on a number of issues with your interview with General Kelly?
I think it's an example of not just the disconnect between John Kelly and President Trump on this issue and others, but perhaps the disconnect between rhetoric and reality here. I think we had Senator Lindsey Graham saying, oh, the wall is symbolic. Lindsey Graham emerging as one of the president's key allies. Even if you look at the president's tweet, in a way he seems to be contradicting himself. He says, oh, the idea of the wall was never abandoned, sort of in the next Twitter breath. He says, oh, we're going to have steel slats in some areas so that people can see through. Right. I think what was really illuminating about what John Kelly said about the wall is that beyond a campaign promise, early on in Kelly's tenure at Homeland Security, he asked the people on the ground who are really on the front lines, on the border every day, what they needed. And what they said they needed was a barrier in some areas, but that would look not like a concrete wall, but would be steel slats, a combination of fencing, but along with more personnel and technology. So that just goes to show that distance between rhetoric and reality, and potentially how difficult it's going to be for whoever comes next as chief of staff or anyone, any official on immigration and border security, to really succeed when the president, in fact, ran and won on some pledges that he may not be able to carry out.
Yeah, you know, I think it's interesting because you see, there seems to be a lack of clarity on Capitol Hill as to exactly what President Trump is looking for. The president seems to have a different interpretation about that all the time. But from your conversation with General Kelly, he seemed pretty clear about it.
Right, and I think, again, that distance not just between rhetoric and reality, but the distance between key officials. I mean, in the middle of a government shutdown that there's no sign of ending anytime soon, and if his allies on the Hill, who are going to need to be the ones negotiating whatever deal comes out of that, aren't clear on, in fact, what the president wants, then I think that indicates that there's sort of more trouble to come, certainly more impasse between the White House and the Hill and really many branches of government.
Yeah, one of the things I was most struck by your piece was that General Kelly told you that his tenure at the White House would be best measured by what the president did not do as opposed to what they accomplished. I mean, what did he mean by that? What specific examples did he point to of things that he actually prevented the president from doing?
I mean, this was sort of the essence of his argument in our conversation as he sort of defended his, very clearly rocky tenure in the White House. But the examples that his defenders will give, and I think that are fairly clear to see, tend to be in the realm of this sort of America first isolationism that the president did clearly run on and win on. So Kelly went into this job with his eyes wide open. But people will point to, for example, the president expressing his interest or his consideration of withdrawing troops from Afghanistan and Syria. He even potentially talked about bringing U.S. troops back from South Korea, pulling out of NATO. And in many of these examples, Kelly and others would suggest that he didn't pursue those things, at least under Kelly's watch, because he was getting, a lot of information from Kelly, but also others that Kelly brought in as part of this sort of interagency process that he instituted to give him information that led him to hold off on those decisions. And then we see about a week after after the confirmation that Kelly would be leaving the White House, we see the president announce that he was going to be pulling troops out of Syria and then he was going to be withdrawing about half the troops from Afghanistan. So I think that's a really key example. But then on other issues, it is notable that where people thought Kelly would differ from the president, perhaps pull him back from the brink, he clearly didn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, but that is kind of an odd place for a chief of staff to be, right? Preventing things as opposed to accomplishing things with the president. I mean, do you think that might be in part why the Kelly tenure as chief of staff was so rocky?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there can be arguments certainly made. Obviously, it's in Kelly's interest to defend his record. I think many people would say, well, the things that did happen, you clearly didn't stop. Other people raise questions about whether he should have resigned if he didn't agree necessarily with what the president was doing. But I think part of the limitations of Kelly's tenure, part of the cause of some of this tension between him and the president and other of the president's aides in the White House that have been well documented, were this attitude that Kelly was supposed to be the adult in the room managing, a clearly mercurial President Trump. And it was clear from the beginning that President Trump didn't like the idea of being managed, and it didn't quite fit his style. And whether or not this sort of more military attitude that he was serving a commander-in-chief, that there was a chain of command, and that when the president made a decision, it was his job to implement it, whether he agreed with it or not, that may not have served either Kelly or the president very well.
Yeah. All right, Molly O'Toole, terrific reporting. Mick Mulvaney signaled that perhaps he's going to take a much different approach. We'll see if that works. Much more coming up in 2019 for sure. Molly O'Toole from the Los Angeles Times, thank you very much. And coming up, it sounds like something straight out of a spy thriller. Why was an ex-Russian spy reportedly pressuring Paul Manafort to pay back billions during the 2016 campaign? But first, this programming note, on New Year's Day, CNN will premiere a new film about the life and work of comedian Gilda Radner. Tune in to Love Gilda at 9 p.m. Eastern Tuesday night. Here's a preview.
Hi, I'm Gilda Radner. And, okay, now. People want to know what made you funny. From the time I was a kid, I loved to pretend.
She was the very first performer chosen for the cast of Saturday Night.
A new report says there is an alleged tie between a Trump campaign chairman and a former Russian spy. Time magazine is reporting that ex-spy Viktor Boyorkin pressured Paul Manafort to repay debts that he owed to Russian billionaire Oleg Deripaska, who has close ties to the Kremlin. A spokesman for Manafort declined to talk to Time or to CNN about the report. Boyorkin told the magazine that he was in touch with Manafort during the campaign when Manafort was Trump's campaign chairman. He says, quote, he owed us a lot of money and he was offering ways to pay it back. Time magazine is the only media outlet that Boyorkin has spoken to about his ties to Manafort. And joining me now is the journalist who wrote that report, Time correspondent Simon Schuster. Simon, thank you for being here. Boyorkin has been pretty quiet about his association to Paul Manafort. How did you get him to talk to you, and what surprised you the most about what he had to say?
Well, it took a whole lot of reporting. As we write in that piece, the investigation we were working on took about 7 months in total that I was working on it. We talked to a lot of sources in the U.S., in Eastern Europe, in Russia, in Ukraine, and our main aim as the kind of baseline for the story was to figure out in those now infamous emails that Paul Manafort was sending during the presidential campaign to his contacts in Ukraine, who was this mystery person that they were referring to as V or Victor. And it was clear that this was a very important contact of Manafort's in Moscow, but his identity wasn't known. Some sources said it was an advisor or an assistant to a Russian oligarch, but we set the goal of figuring out who this was. And from sources in the U.S., we got his name.
Wow. I mean, Viktor Boyorkin is a pretty mysterious figure, right? I mean, he is a former Russian intelligence officer. I mean, what more can you tell us about his background?
Yeah, he does, as you said at the top, have the kind of background that reads like a spy novel. He served, as he told me, in the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. as an assistant naval attaché. And his name is in U.S. government archives under that title, but that title is often used by many countries as a cover for an intelligence agent. He also served in Mexico, in the Russian embassy there, and then moved into the arms trade. In the early 2000s, he was involved in selling warships and gunships for coast guards and navies in various countries, especially in Africa and other parts of the developing world. And then he went to work for this Russian oligarch as a kind of all-around fixer, special projects operative for this oligarch. So he's had quite the illustrious career.
Yeah, and that oligarch, Oleg Deripaska, really could be the key to how this all tracks back to Paul Manafort. We know that Deripaska has close ties with the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin in particular. I mean, what do you know about Boyorkin's relationship with Deripaska, and then how it could possibly connect to Paul Manafort?
Well, the relationship between Boyorkin and Deripaska is quite clear. Boyorkin was an employee of Deripaska for around a decade. He worked sometimes freelance, sometimes kind of focusing on special projects, but they were a team in Russia and working internationally for Deripaska's business empire. Now, around 2006, Manafort got in touch with Deripaska, and they began working on projects, essentially lobbying deals and various kinds of consulting and political influence in Eastern Europe. And that's where the three of them kind of got to know each other and began working together. Now remember, this is 10 years before the U.S. presidential elections of 2016. So they've known each other for a long time. They have a lot of business ties going back years. And they have some failed business ventures that led them to accuse each other of owing each other money. And that situation with the debts seemed to come to a head right around the time of the U.S. presidential elections. So what I learned most importantly from Boyorkin when I spoke to him is that they were putting pressure on Manafort, including during the election campaign, to pay back the money that Deripaska says Manafort owes him. So that was the kind of key information, as I saw it, because it showed that powerful figures in Russia had significant leverage over the chairman of the Trump campaign in 2016.
Now, this has not been a part of the Mueller investigation that we've seen, at least publicly. It was not part of the charging documents against Paul Manafort. And Boyorkin told you that he was approached by the special counsel's office, which is investigating these ties, and he told them to go dig a ditch. I mean, are there other ways for Mueller to connect the dots without specifically talking to Boyorkin or Deripaska directly, because it appears that they are not willing to play ball?
It's very hard for me to say, what Robert Mueller does or doesn't know. He runs a very tight ship, and there have been very few leaks, if any, from his office. But it's clear that Boyorkin is certainly on the radar now of the U.S. government. He was put on a sanctions list, a very strict kind of financial sanctions list, on December 19th. And that is what led also our editors and myself to kind of accelerate the publication, because now Boyorkin was in the public eye, and we felt it was very much in the public's interest to know who this person is. So I think we're going to be hearing more about him, but again, I have no idea what Mueller is considering vis-a-vis Boyorkin or Deripaska.
Well, it reads like a spy novel. This is real life. A really incredible reporting, Simon, by you and your team. We so appreciate you coming on to share your insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And still to come, Senator Lindsey Graham says when it comes to the president's plan to withdraw troops from Syria, the U.S. is now in a pause situation. So is the president changing his strategy? We'll